The first component of DevOps methodology that I want to discuss is culture and sharing. And I think that this image actually perfectly sort of illustrates our goal in a DevOps organization. Our goal is to bring these different teams together so that they can share and collaborate and accelerate the process of service delivery in the organization. Now, to sort of frame the challenges that we experience in our technology organizations, I want to talk a little bit about the partition that forms naturally between development and operations teams within companies. Your software developers are charged with the task of writing code and building new features, addressing software defects, and they spend days and weeks working on software. And at some point, they decide to release that software. And when they release that software, at least traditionally, they sort of throw it over the wall to the operations team, and the operations team then is charged with deploying that software into a production environment and then providing ongoing maintenance and monitoring of that software code and that software platform. And what happens is that because these are, completely separate teams, oftentimes located on different parts of a building or even different parts of a country, is that there's this sort of barrier that forms between the two parts of the organization. And this is what we call the wall of confusion. And that wall of confusion forms because these two different teams have differing priorities. I love this meme, and this is really common on the internet. And it's a really common problem that we experience in the real world, and that's, developers are writing software code, they're testing and building it on their local development workstation, and the code worked just fine in their development environment. Then they handed it over, they threw it over the wall to the operations team. The operations team deployed it into production, and the code blows up. The service is failing and no longer working. The operations team points at the developers and says, "Hey, why is your code failing?" And the developers sort of shrug their shoulders and say, "Well, the code worked just fine in our development environment." And this sort of scenario I've seen replayed just dozens and dozens of times in my career. And it happens in nearly every organization. Our challenge is, how do we address this problem where the development team and the operations team have these differing priorities? How do we get them to communicate and collaborate better together so that we don't encounter these sort of release challenges with our software? Well, part of it is to recognize that these different teams have conflicting measures of success. Your development teams, and their success is based on their ability to make changes, their ability to produce lines of code and commit code and address the stories in their sprint. Teams are measured based upon their velocity in a sort of a Scrum Agile sort of methodology. Operations teams, on the other hand, their success is measured by service availability and uptime, performance and resiliency. So operations teams are sort of incentivized not to change things. They don't want things to change. They want a steady state where the platform is running successfully and supporting the needs of customers and delighting customers. And so the software developers are on sort of one side of the fence, and they're creating code changes, and they're pushing those changes, throwing them over the fence as fast as they can. And the operations team is sitting there saying, "Hey, wait a minute, are these changes actually going to improve the platform? What is the risk associated with this change?" Well, so one of the ways, and perhaps the most important way that we can sort of address some of these challenges within our organization, this natural partition which is formed between the development and operations teams, and the natural silos which form, is to focus on the culture and to build a culture which is highly collaborative. And that's one of the main goals of the DevOps methodology. To build a collaborative culture, one where the teams within the organization are both multidisciplined and they're focused on service delivery. They're focused on what I consider to be sort of the greater good. If you look at your traditional software development teams, oftentimes those teams are organized in a very functional sort of way, where team members are sort of interchangeable, and you will bring different team members to a particular project. You sort of assemble people based around the project. In a modern software organization, we'll oftentimes build teams around more of a product approach, where each team is multidisciplinary in the sense that it's not just all software developers. You'll have software developers and maybe a business analyst and a quality assurance engineer and maybe a site reliability or release engineer. So essentially that team will have all of the different people and all the different skill sets necessary to support a particular service or product. And that team will own the entire life cycle of the product, from inception all the way through delivery and operations. And the key point there is that it supports collaboration, because that team owns that product in a sense, and they are completely accountable for the service delivery. DevOps also encourages a very transparent sort of culture. And this is a culture where people are sharing information with one another. They're not trying to hide information. And it's a blameless environment. We recognize that people make mistakes. Oftentimes those mistakes aren't necessarily based on a lack of experience or a lack of quality in that individual. Those mistakes are due to poor documentation, poor training, fragile software code, etc. So in a DevOps culture, we tend not to blame people. We blame the process. DevOps cultures are also very change-oriented. Our traditional IT organizations generally hate change. They try to avoid change whenever possible, and they batch up changes, which increase the risk of change. DevOps organizations expect change. They embrace change. They look at change as a learning opportunity. And even when they fail, they'll fail quickly and recover quickly and take the lessons learned from that experience to improve the service delivery process in the future. I love this image, hugs squash bugs. And this is a sort of a marketing pitch for something called Hug Ops. And I think it actually makes a good point. And that's, part of a DevOps culture is this notion of shared empathy. It's one where the software development team members will empathize with the operations people and recognize that the operations people have a really challenging job, and the software developer needs to help the operations team make their job easier, and vice versa. That the operations team members have to recognize that the software developers also have a really challenging mission, and that they can help the software developers out by engaging earlier in the software development process to ensure that software developers have a good understanding of operational requirements. One of the questions that people oftentimes ask me is, how do I know if my organization has a DevOps culture? Because, how do you really describe what a culture is like? And that's a really big challenge. Oftentimes when I have conversations with senior IT leaders in the region, these IT leaders, they've spent 20 plus years working in a very traditional IT organization. And one of the biggest challenges they have is that they're being charged with bringing in these new DevOps methodologies and building a modern software development organization, but they've never worked in that sort of organization in the past. So it's hard for them to really describe what it feels like to work in a DevOps culture. And so I've put together a few questions to sort of, help you understand or help you think about what it would be like to work in a DevOps culture. So the first question to think about is, in your organization, you have software development team members and you have operations team members or maybe IT team members. Do those team members from different groups, do they sit near one another? Are they talking to one another often? Do they go out to lunch together? Do they celebrate success together? Do your operations people regularly attend your software development inception or stand-up or retrospective meetings? If you're a part of a software development team and you have a daily stand-up, is an operations team member part of that stand-up? And if you were to ask one of your software development team members, would they be able to describe in detail how their code is ultimately promoted through the organization and then deployed into a production environment? And these are some questions that should get you thinking a bit. And in most cases, I'd say 90+% of organizations that I meet with and talk to, the answer to these questions would be no. That their developers and operations people don't have lunch together. They're generally not attending one another's meetings. The developers understand how to commit their code to a repository, but once it's pushed and merged, and it's on a sort of a pipeline to deployment in production land, they generally have little or no idea how that actually happens. So one of our goals, again, with the DevOps methodology, is to build a culture where people are sharing and collaborating together, and where everyone has a shared understanding of this mission around delivering software.